Imagine sitting around a roaring campfire on an absolutely freezing cold night in the dead of winter. It is February 8th, 1874, and you are in a massive snow-covered valley deep in the mountains of western Colorado. On this night, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan was sitting right next to that fire, rubbing his hands together to try and keep them warm. Surrounding him was a large group of men who were all doing the exact same thing. They were all gold prospectors, which meant they spent their entire lives traveling all across the Wild West, looking for gold and hoping to strike it rich. But for the past several weeks, this entire group had been completely trapped inside of this valley. The reason they were stuck was because of a series of absolutely relentless winter storms. Every few days, a new storm would roll in over the peaks and dump up to 6 feet of heavy, wet snow all over the landscape. It was impossible to travel, and everyone knew that if they tried to leave, they would quickly freeze to death or get completely lost. But on this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the wood and hearing some of the other men tell stories about their past adventures, one of Israel's friends stood up. This man was named Alfred Packer. Alfred walked over to the center of the camp and began making a pitch to the entire group. He wanted everyone to pack up their gear and leave the valley with him right away. Alfred told them that the weather was finally starting to turn. He pointed out that the snow was beginning to melt in some places, and he claimed that he knew a secret pathway out of the valley. He promised the group that this path would lead them safely through the mountains in just 2 weeks, and it would bring them directly to Breckenridge, Colorado. Now, Breckenridge was a legendary area among prospectors because everyone knew it was filled with incredibly rich gold deposits. Alfred was basically telling them that they could get out of the cold early and get rich at the same time. It sounded like a perfect plan. After Alfred finished speaking, he sat back down by the fire. For a moment, nobody said anything. The entire camp just stayed completely quiet. Israel looked around at the faces of the other prospectors to see if anyone was going to take Alfred up on his offer. But Israel knew that, unlike him, most of the other men in the camp did not like Alfred at all. They thought Alfred was lazy, difficult to work with, and overall just a very unpleasant person to be around. But Israel believed that the real reason the others disliked Alfred was actually because Alfred suffered from epilepsy. Back in those days, people did not understand epilepsy very well. Because Alfred would periodically have severe seizures, the other men viewed him as a massive liability. They felt that on a dangerous journey through the wilderness, everyone needed to pull their own weight and be completely reliable. They were terrified of being out in the middle of nowhere and having Alfred have a seizure, which would make him unable to help or force them to carry him. But to Israel, Alfred's medical condition did not matter at all. He did not see Alfred as a liability. In fact, Israel thought Alfred was actually a very smart, very bold guy. For Alfred to stand up in front of everyone and pitch this daring plan was exactly the kind of thing Israel admired about him. Alfred was someone who wanted to take action and get things done, and Israel liked that. Even though Israel liked Alfred, he was still hesitant to just blindly follow him into the snowy mountains. He was sitting there weighing the pros and the cons of the plan, trying to decide what to do. As he was thinking, Israel looked across the fire and noticed a very large man sitting there. This man looked incredibly serious, and he was slowly shaking his head back and forth, as if to say there is no way you should do this. Then, the big man stood up. He walked over, held his hand out directly in front of Alfred's face, and told him to stop talking. The big man looked around at everyone and said that if they left the valley right now, every single one of them would die. After he said that, the big man sat back down. The entire camp fell into a tense, heavy silence. This big man was not a gold prospector. His name was Ore, and he was the chief of the Tabagwash band of the Ute tribe. Chief Ore actually lived in this valley with his people, and he had recently saved the lives of every single prospector sitting around that fire. A few weeks earlier, the prospectors had wandered into the valley, completely lost, freezing, and on the brink of starvation. Chief Ore and his tribe had found them, brought them food and clean water, and helped them set up a safe campsite right near the river. Chief Ore had told them very clearly that they must stay put in this camp and wait out the rest of the winter. He promised them that once the spring came and the snow finally melted, it would be safe to leave, and his people would help guide them out. At first, the prospectors were incredibly grateful. They had no problem agreeing to stay in the camp until spring. But now, after weeks of being cooped up in the snow, they were getting extremely restless. They were terrified that if they did not get to the gold field soon, other prospectors would get there first and take all the gold. For Israel, there was even more pressure. He had promised his family back home that this would be his very last treasure hunting trip. He could not afford to go home empty-handed. He needed to find gold so he could support his family and finally retire. So, when Alfred broke the silence, looked at Chief Array, and said that he appreciated the warning, but was still going to leave early, Israel decided to make his choice. He saw the sheer determination in Alfred's eyes and knew he had to go with him. Israel stood up and volunteered. Right after Israel spoke up, 4 other prospectors also decided to join them. Chief Ore realized that he was not going to be able to change these men's minds. They were too stubborn and too focused on getting rich. So, instead of trying to stop them, the chief decided to do everything he could to help them survive. He called the 6 volunteers over and drew a detailed map in the dirt. He told them they must follow the river out of the valley, and they absolutely must go around the San Juan mountain range. He warned them that if they tried to climb over those high peaks, they would never survive. He explained that once they bypassed the mountains, they would find a small supply outpost where they could rest, get food, and then continue on to Breckenridge. He marked a large X in the dirt where the outpost was, and then he walked away, got on his horse, and rode back to his village. The next morning, the 6 men began packing their heavy gear. One of the other prospectors who had decided to stay behind offered to help them carry their supplies. He had a horse, and he said he would walk with them as far as he could until the trail became too difficult for the animal. The men gladly accepted the help, and shortly after breakfast, they set off into the freezing cold. As they hiked up out of the valley, they could see the massive, jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains looming in the distance. They made sure to stay close to the river, just as Chief Aure had instructed. Israel was trudging through the deep snow, carrying a metal coffee pot, but he did not have coffee inside of it. Instead, he had filled the pot with hot, glowing coals from their morning campfire. This was an old wilderness trick. The hot coals kept his hands warm as he walked, and if his matches got wet, he could easily use the coals to start a new fire. As Israel was walking, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Alfred. Alfred looked absolutely miserable. He was shivering, his face was red, and he was clearly struggling with the freezing temperature. Without hesitating, Israel handed the warm metal coffee pot to his friend. Alfred took it, clutched it tightly against his chest, and looked at Israel with pure gratitude. None of these prospectors were wealthy, but Alfred was easily the poorest of them all. He had virtually nothing to his name, and Israel had naturally taken on a protective, fatherly role over him. Alfred was only 30 years old, which was half of Israel's age. Alfred had previously confided in Israel about his tragic past. When the Civil War broke out, Alfred had tried to enlist in the Union Army on 2 separate occasions because he desperately wanted to fight. But both times, the military kicked him out as soon as they discovered he had epilepsy. Alfred was so proud of his attempt to serve that he had actually tattooed his name and his military battalion on his arm. But because Alfred did not know how to read or write, he had misspelled his own name to the tattoo artist. Instead of Alfred, the tattoo spelled out Alfred with an E instead of an R. From that day on, everyone called him Alfred. After being rejected by the army, Alfred had drifted from town to town, working odd jobs, never making any money, and never starting a family. Israel really felt for him. To show his appreciation for the warm coffee pot, Alfred reached into his coat, pulled out a flask of whiskey, and handed it to Israel. For the next few hours, the 2 friends walked side by side, sharing the whiskey and passing the warm pot of coals back and forth. By late afternoon, the snow began to fall heavily again. The prospector with the horse stopped and told them that his animal could not go any further. He dropped their extra supplies in the snow, turned his horse around, and headed back toward the safety of Chief Aure's valley. The 6 men watched him disappear into the whiteout. They knew they were completely on their own now. They just had to survive for 2 weeks, and they would reach the outpost. But 2 weeks went by, and the 6 men did not show up at the outpost. Another 2 weeks passed, and there was still no sign of them. The weather had turned absolutely brutal just days after they left, with massive blizzards burying the mountains in feet of fresh snow. But because the only people who knew they had left were the other prospectors and the Ute tribe, who were both completely snowed in, no one on the outside world even knew these men were missing. Then, on April 16, 1874, nearly 2 months after the journey began, the officials running the supply outpost were sitting inside a log cabin, eating breakfast. Suddenly, the front door burst open. The officials jumped up and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was completely filthy, with incredibly long, matted hair and a wild, bushy beard. He was holding a rifle in one hand and a metal coffee pot in the other. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and he was shivering violently. It was Alfred Packer. The officials immediately brought him inside, shut the door, and sat him down by the stove. They gave him food, which he began shoving into his mouth as fast as he could, but within seconds his stomach rejected it and he threw up on the floor. Alfred apologized, explaining that he had been starving in the woods for weeks, and his body just could not handle real food yet. The officials cleaned him up, gave him warm clothes, and poured him a glass of whiskey. After Alfred calmed down, they asked him what had happened to the rest of his group. Alfred closed his eyes and looked like he was about to cry. He told them that they had decided to cut through the San Juan Mountains against the advice of Chief Aure. But as they climbed higher, the snow became too deep, and Alfred, due to his poor physical condition, could not keep up. He claimed that the other 5 men had simply abandoned him to die in the freezing wilderness. He had to watch as his friends walked away into the snow, leaving him behind. Alfred said he survived by stumbling through the forest, eating wild roots and pine needles. and occasionally wrapping his leather shoes in wet leaves and cooking them over a fire so he could chew on the leather. He said the only reason he was alive was because he had the metal coffee pot with the coals, which allowed him to make fires at night. The officials were deeply moved by his story of survival, but they also realized that the other 5 prospectors were almost certainly dead. Since Alfred was too weak to travel, they could not launch a search party right away. It was not until the summer of that year, when the snow finally melted, that the truth would come to light. On August 20th, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through the woods in western Colorado, sketchpad in hand. As he walked through a heavily forested area, he began to notice a terrible, nauseating smell in the air. He decided to follow the odor to see what it was, and it led him to a small clearing in the trees. When John stepped into the clearing, he froze in absolute horror. Lying on the ground, side by side in a neat row, were 5 dead bodies. They were in various states of decay. 2 of the bodies had been completely reduced to skeletons, while the other 3 still had flesh on them. But the most disturbing thing was that their chests had been sliced wide open with incredible surgical precision. It looked like someone had carefully butchered them like animals. One of the men was missing his head entirely, and the others had their skulls completely crushed. John noticed a cold campfire pit just a few yards away and a faint trail leading further into the woods. He followed the trail and found a small, makeshift shelter that looked like someone had been living in it for months. John realized with sudden, terrifying clarity what had happened. Someone had murdered these 5 men, lived in this shelter, and had been systematically cutting pieces of meat off their bodies and cooking them over the fire. Terrified that the killer might still be nearby, John ran back to his sketchpad, quickly drew a map of the scene, and ran as fast as he could to the nearest town to contact the authorities. It would turn out that Alfred Packer had lied about everything. He had not been abandoned. Instead, he had stayed with the group, and at some point during the freezing nights, he had murdered them all. He used Israel's warm metal coffee pot to build fires, and then he used his knife to butcher his friends and eat them to survive. When police eventually captured Alfred, they searched the campsite John had found. Ironically, just yards away from the shelter, they found the carcass of a deer that Alfred could have easily eaten. But Alfred had ignored the deer entirely. He had developed a preference for the taste of human flesh. Alfred was put on trial for murder. He claimed that one of the men, Shannon Bell, had gone mad from hunger and killed the others, and Alfred had only killed Bell in self-defense. But the physical evidence did not match his story at all. 4 of the men had been killed while they were fast asleep in their bedrolls. The only man who showed signs of a violent struggle was Israel Swan, the elderly man who had protected Alfred and treated him like a son. Alfred was convicted of murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. In 1901, after serving a portion of his sentence, he was paroled. Upon his release, Alfred Packer did something truly bizarre. He became a strict vegetarian, claiming he could never stomach the thought of eating meat again. He lived out his remaining years quietly and died a few years later. Now, our next story takes us from the mountains of Colorado to a completely different kind of mystery, one that has baffled historians and scientists for decades. In 1979, a highly respected newspaper published an article that described a woman's life as one of the most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation ever recorded. This woman was named Dorothy Eady, but later in her life, she would be known to the world as Amidi. Dorothy was born in a lower middle-class suburb of London in 1904. She was an only child, and her parents absolutely worshipped her. But when Dorothy was just 3 years old, she was running down the stairs in her home, lost her footing, and fell all the way to the bottom. She hit her head on the hard floor and went completely limp. Her parents frantically called for the family doctor, who rushed to the house. After examining the little girl, the doctor looked at her heartbroken parents and officially pronounced her dead. He left the room to prepare the paperwork, leaving the parents to grieve. But about an hour later, the doctor and the parents walked back into the bedroom to collect Dorothy's body. When they opened the door, they were absolutely stunned. Dorothy was not dead. She was sitting upright on her bed, happily playing with her toys as if nothing had ever happened. Her parents were furious at the doctor, believing he was incredibly incompetent for declaring their living daughter dead. But the doctor insisted that when he examined her, she had no pulse and was not breathing. Shortly after this near-death experience, Dorothy began to speak with a very strange, distinct accent that her parents could not identify. Specialists who examined her believed she was suffering from a rare condition called foreign accent syndrome, which sometimes occurs after a person suffers a major head injury, but that was not the only change. Dorothy also began having a vivid, recurring dream. In this dream, she was standing in a beautiful, lush garden filled with exotic flowers and green trees. Right next to the garden was a massive, magnificent building with towering stone pillars. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace and happiness in this place. Dorothy became so homesick for this dream location that her mother would frequently find her crying in her bed. When her mother tried to comfort her and remind her that she was safe in her own home in London, Dorothy would shake her head and cry, telling her mother that London was not her real home. She insisted that her true home was the place with the large stone pillars and the beautiful garden. When Dorothy was 4 years old, her parents decided to take her on a trip to the British Museum in London. At the time, the museum was hosting a massive exhibition on ancient Egypt. As soon as Dorothy walked into the exhibit hall, her entire demeanor changed. She stopped walking and stared at the glass cases filled with ancient artifacts. Suddenly, she broke away from her parents and began running through the museum. She ran up to the massive stone statues of the pharaohs and the ancient Egyptian gods. To the shock of the other museum visitors, the little girl began kissing the feet of the statues and sobbing hysterically. She was hugging the cold stone and screaming at the top of her lungs that she was finally home and she was back with her people. She refused to leave, and her embarrassed parents had to physically drag her out of the building. From that day on, Dorothy became completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. She spent all of her free time reading books about the pharaohs and the pyramids, but her obsession soon began to cause major problems in her daily life. Her family was very religious and sent her to a strict Catholic Sunday school. But Dorothy kept getting into trouble because she would constantly question the priest, comparing Catholic teachings to ancient Egyptian religious beliefs. Eventually, the church told her parents that she was no longer allowed to attend Sunday school. A short time later, she was expelled from her primary school because she refused to sing a religious hymn that contained lyrics disparaging the ancient Egyptians. She was even banned from attending Sunday Mass. When Dorothy was 6 years old, she began looking at books containing pictures of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. She told her parents that the symbols looked incredibly familiar to her, as if she had known how to read them a long time ago but had simply forgotten. Then, when she was 7, she was flipping through a history textbook and came across a photograph of the Temple of Seti I, located in Abydos, Egypt. Next to the temple ruins in the photo was a flat, dusty area of dirt. As soon as Dorothy saw the picture, she gasped and pointed at it. She told her mother that this temple was her actual home, but then she looked closer at the flat dirt area and looked confused. She asked her mother where all the trees and the beautiful flowers were and why the garden had been destroyed. She did not understand that the photo showed the ruins as they looked thousands of years after she had seen them in her dreams. In the same textbook, there was a picture of the well-preserved mummy of Pharaoh Seti I. When Dorothy saw his face, she broke down in tears, claiming that she knew him personally and that he had been a very kind, loving man. At age 10, Dorothy was visiting the British Museum when she was noticed by a world-famous Egyptologist named E.A. Wallace Budge. He was fascinated by her intense interest in the artifacts and offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics. To his absolute amazement, Dorothy picked up the incredibly complex ancient language almost instantly, learning it much faster than any of his adult university students. When she turned 14, her peaceful dreams of the temple garden turned into a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she was trapped in a dark stone room underground. A terrifying high priestess was standing over her, aggressively demanding that she answer a series of questions. When Dorothy refused to speak, the high priestess would brutally beat her. Dorothy would wake up from this nightmare shivering and screaming in terror. In 1931, when Dorothy was 27 years old, she met an Egyptian man who was living in London. They fell in love and decided to get married. Dorothy was thrilled, largely because marrying him meant she could finally move to Egypt and live there permanently. The moment their ship docked in Egypt, Dorothy fell to her knees on the harbor dock, kissed the dirty ground, and began weeping with joy, telling everyone around her that she was finally back where she belonged. Shortly after their arrival, they had a son, and Dorothy insisted on naming him Seti after the ancient pharaoh. It was during her first year living in Egypt that Dorothy began to experience very strange episodes. In the middle of the night, she would enter a deep, trance-like state. She would get out of bed, completely unaware of her surroundings, and sit at her desk. She would then begin frantically writing page after page of perfect Egyptian hieroglyphics. Her husband would wake up and try to talk to her, but she would not respond to him. She was completely unresponsive, her eyes fixed on the paper as her hand moved at lightning speed. When she finally woke up from these trances, she would have no memory of what she had done. But over the course of a year, she amassed more than 70 pages of these written hieroglyphics. When she translated them, she discovered they contained a highly detailed, incredibly personal story. The writings claimed to be from a spirit named Hor-Ra, who was the spirit of Pharaoh Seti I. Hor-Ra was dictating the story of Dorothy's past life. According to the pages, in her previous life, Dorothy was an ancient Egyptian woman named Bentreshit. Her father had been a soldier in Seti's army, and her mother was a poor vegetable seller who died when Bentreshit was only 3 years old. Because her father was away fighting in wars and could not care for her, he left her at the Temple of Seti in Abydos, where she was raised by the priests. Bentreshit eventually took sacred vows to become a consecrated priestess, which required her to remain a virgin for the rest of her life. But a few years later, Pharaoh Seti visited the temple. He met Bentreshit in the temple garden, and the two fell deeply in love. They began a secret affair, and Bentrashit soon became pregnant. When the high priest of the temple discovered her pregnancy, he dragged her into an underground room and interrogated her, demanding to know the identity of the father. Bentrashit knew that if she revealed her lover was the pharaoh, it would cause a massive political scandal that would ruin Seti's reign. She refused to speak, and she was severely beaten. This was the exact event from Dorothy's childhood nightmares. To protect the man she loved from ruin, Bentrashit went back to her quarters and took her own life. Dorothy's husband became deeply disturbed by his wife's middle-of-the-night trances and her claims of being a reincarnated Egyptian priestess. The strain on their marriage became too much to handle, and in 1936, they officially divorced. Dorothy took her young son Seti and moved to a small village near the Giza pyramids. She legally changed her name to Seti, which translates to Mother of Seti, and she managed to get a job working as a draftsperson for the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. She was the first woman ever hired by the department. For the next 20 years, Seti worked tirelessly, using her incredible knowledge of ancient history to help map and document archaeological sites. But her ultimate dream was to return to Abydos, the place she believed she had lived 3,000 years ago. In 1956, she finally got her chance. She was granted a transfer to Abydos, even though it came with a significant pay cut. The moment she arrived at the ruins of the Temple of Seti, she walked directly to a room she had never seen before in her modern life and set up her office there. She lived a very simple life in a mud brick house near the ruins. She even befriended a wild cobra that lived in the temple, feeding it by hand every day, which terrified the local villagers. While many archaeologists initially thought Seti was completely insane, they quickly realized that her knowledge of the temple was absolutely flawless. When she first arrived, the chief archaeologist wanted to test her claims. He took her into the temple in the pitch black of night with no lights. He walked her into a random, unexcavated room and asked her to describe what paintings were on the walls based solely on her memory of her past life. Seti went wall by wall, describing the exact scenes, the colors of the paint, and the hieroglyphic inscriptions in perfect detail. When they turned on the lights, she was 100% correct. There was no way she could have read about these paintings in any book, because they had never been published or documented before. Seti's most incredible contribution occurred when she walked out into the flat, empty dirt area next to the temple. She pointed to a specific spot and told the excavation team that if they dug there, they would find the ancient temple garden. She described the exact dimensions of the garden, the location of the water channels, and even the specific types of fruit trees that had been planted there 3,000 years ago. The archaeologists were highly skeptical, but they decided to dig. To their absolute astonishment, they uncovered the remains of an ancient garden exactly where she said it would be. The irrigation layout was exactly as she had described, and when they analyzed the soil, they found the organic remains of the exact tree species she had listed. She also pointed to the north side of the temple and claimed there was a hidden subterranean tunnel running underneath the stone floor. Once again, the team excavated the area and discovered the secret tunnel, which had remained hidden and completely unknown to modern historians for thousands of years. Later, Seti told researchers to look in a very specific unexplored area of the Valley of the Kings to find a lost tomb. They followed her directions and discovered a previously unknown ancient tomb. Despite decades of trying to prove that Seti was running an elaborate hoax, skeptics and professional Egyptologists could never explain how she possessed such intimate, highly accurate knowledge of a time period 3,000 years in the past. Before Seti passed away in 1981 at the age of 77, she told her close friends that there was a massive secret chamber hidden deep beneath the Temple of Seti, containing priceless historical records that would change our understanding of the ancient world forever. But because she did not tell them the exact location before she died, the chamber remains undiscovered to this day. Now, our third story takes us to the quiet, hardworking heartland of America, where a family's search for peace led them into the path of an absolute monster. In 1989, Wilshire, Ohio was an incredibly small, quiet town with a population of less than 600 people. It was the kind of place where everybody knew their neighbors, nobody locked their front doors, and the biggest news of the week was usually the high school football game. It was a peaceful, safe place to raise a family. One of the families living in Wilshire at the time was the Rogers family. The parents, Hal and Joan, who went by Joe, were both 36 years old. They had two beautiful daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 14-year-old Christy. Hal and Joe had been high school sweethearts. Joe was extremely popular, outgoing, and loved to laugh, while Hal was very quiet, reserved, and spent most of his time working. Despite their opposite personalities, they were deeply in love and had built a wonderful life together. Right after graduating from high school, Joe became pregnant with Michelle. They got married, bought a dairy farm, and threw themselves into the grueling work of running a farm. A few years later, Christy was born and their family was complete. Running a dairy farm is incredibly hard work and the profit margins are very thin. To help pay the bills, Joe had to take a second job working the night shift at a local auto parts factory. She would spend her days helping Hal on the farm and her nights driving a forklift and working on the assembly line. Despite how exhausted they were, Hal and Joe always made time for their family. The girls loved the farm animals, and the home was always filled with laughter. But their happy life was completely shattered when they discovered a horrific secret. Hal's brother John lived in a trailer on